Lesson 36, Fighting World War II. What military strategies did the United States and its allies pursue to defeat the Axis powers in World War II? Introduction: the United States began mobilizing troops for war after the Pearl Harbor attack. Some of these soldiers would be sent to Europe to fight the German army, but first they would have to cross the Atlantic Ocean on troop ships, braving attacks by Germany's deadly U-boat fleet. Since the start of the war in 1939, German U-boats had aimed to disrupt and destroy Allied shipping in the Atlantic. During this phase of the war, known as the Battle of the Atlantic, U-boats sank thousands of ships carrying vital war supplies. When the United States entered the war, its Atlantic coastal waters were relatively unprotected, as freighters and oil tankers sailed along the coast without military escort. U-boats began to prowl the area, sinking ships on the East Coast and in the Gulf of Mexico. The United States was ill-prepared to mount a response to these attacks, since it did not have sufficient naval vessels, nor did it require coastal cities to observe nighttime blackouts. The city lights enabled U-boats to spot ships as they entered or departed American ports, making them easy prey for German torpedoes. In the early months of 1942, U-boats sank dozens of American ships off the Atlantic coast. At night, coastal residents could hear the hum of U-boats just offshore and could even see ships burning out at sea. Oil spills and wrecked ship debris washed up on the beaches along the East Coast. The United States soon devised a plan to counter the U-boat, and the country's naval losses lessened shortly thereafter. As in World War I, the Allies used the convoy system, where destroyers and other naval vessels surround and protect unarmed ships. In addition, the United States began a feverish period of shipbuilding, and by 1943 it was producing enough ships to replace lost vessels and to defend against U-boat attacks. This new U.S. fleet would play a key role in naval battles during the war, as well as support Allied ground and air forces. U.S. Marines raised the American flag on Mount Suribachi during the Battle of Iwo Jima, Japan in 1945, as part of the U.S. Allied push through the Pacific during World War II. Build for your Navy. German U-boats sank dozens of American ships in 1942. By 1943, the United States began to reduce its naval losses using the convoy system. One additional factor that helped defend against U-boat attacks was an increase of American shipbuilding. The newly constructed U.S. fleet would be critical to the Allied battles during the war. Preparing for war in Europe. In late December 1941, Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill met in Washington, D.C. to devise a strategy to help the Allies defeat the Axis powers. They knew they could not afford to fight an offensive war on two fronts, Europe and the Pacific, simultaneously, so they decided on a strategy of Europe first. Per the strategy, the Allies would concentrate most of their forces on a European offensive, while initially fighting a defensive war against Japan in the Pacific. Axis powers roll across Europe into North Africa. When the United States entered the World War II, the Axis powers controlled most of Europe. Great Britain had successfully fought off an intense German air attack during the Battle of Britain, but the country's money and resources were dwindling. On the Eastern Front, the Nazis had invaded the Soviet Union using blitzkrieg tactics to overcome Soviet troops amassed on the border. One large German force nearly reached Moscow before the onset of winter froze its advance. Another force marched toward the Soviet Union's oil-rich Caucasus region. Oil played a key role in the Axis strategy. Hitler already controlled oil fields in Romania, but he sought more oil to fuel his war machine. He also hoped to sever Allied oil supply from the Middle East. To do this, Hitler would first have to secure North Africa by driving the British out of Egypt. In 1941, Hitler sent Field Marshal Erwin Rommel and his Afrika Korps, a tank-based division of the German army, to join the Italian army in North Africa. By June of 1941, Rommel's forces had taken much of the region and had pushed deep into Egypt. Europeans suffer under German occupation. At the start of 1942, the Axis powers controlled much of Europe and North Africa. Hitler and the Nazis were unable to take Great Britain, however. The sheer size of the Axis-controlled territory demonstrates the enormous challenges faced by the Allies as they considered strategies for fighting the war. Many people were suffering in Nazi-occupied Europe. Some lived under puppet governments like Vichy France, while others endured harsh military rule. The SS, a brutal military unit of the Nazi Party, forced millions of Europeans to labor in the German arms industry. The SS treated the Russians, Poles, and other Slavs with notable contempt, in part because Hitler believed Slavs were subhuman. The Nazis worked them to death and killed large groups of Slavs outright. No group suffered more than the Jews. Hitler had long been obsessed with answering the Jewish question: how to rid Germany of Jews. He stripped Jews of their civil rights and had them beaten and killed and confined to the concentration camps. More Jews came under Nazi control as Nazi Germany expanded, so the Jewish question became more critical. The Nazis forcibly moved Jews throughout Europe into overcrowded ghettos, small sections of cities that could be walled off and guarded. The largest ghetto the Nazis established was the Warsaw Ghetto in Poland. Thousands of people died from starvation and disease in the ghettos. Gradually, the Nazis decided on what they called the final solution. As part of this plan, they would systematically exterminate the Jews. The slaughter began in the Soviet Union shortly after the Nazis invaded in 1941. Mobile killing squads rounded up and murdered thousands of Soviet Jews. In early 1942, the Nazis built the first of 6 death camps in Poland. Jews, many from ghettos, were shipped to these camps by rail, often packed into cattle cars. Unlike regular concentration camps, these death camps were equipped with gas chambers. Camp operators sealed groups of Jews and other prisoners inside these rooms before releasing poison gas, usually carbon monoxide. Pregnant women, young children, and the elderly and the sick were killed shortly after arrival. But able-bodied prisoners were kept alive as long as they could work, often at a nearby factory. Each death camp could kill tens of thousands of people each month, including Jews, homosexuals, disabled people, captured Soviet soldiers, and Roma, referred to as gypsies by the Nazis, among others. Allied leaders debate war strategies. When Roosevelt and Churchill met in Washington, D.C. in 1941, they were unaware of the Nazis' final solution. Rather, their goal was to figure out how to win the war in Europe, and to do this, they had to first debate a number of potential strategies. The Allies had limited resources at the time. For at least a few months, the Allies would have to focus on defending their territory against the Axis power, while the United States gathered troops and war materials. Afterwards, they would go on the offensive, but they needed to decide where to target. They had several choices. Occupied France was a possibility because the French would support an Allied invasion. Nearby Britain could also serve as a staging area for the massing of troops and resources before a French assault. However, German army's presence was strong in France, making such an invasion extremely difficult. Some believed a direct attack on Italy was more practical, as the Italian army was relatively weak, and the country would provide a good base for securing the rest of Europe. But sailing through U-boat-infested Mediterranean would be dangerous. Still, others wanted to launch the Allied offensive in North Africa, which was not as well defended and could also serve as a gateway to Europe. But it was far from Germany. The ultimate target would test the Allies' ability to transport and maintain their forces. Another plan called for moving troops into the Soviet Union to help the Soviet Red Army force the Germans out. Now, one of the U.S. allies, the USSR, greatly needed its partner's help, but transporting and supplying forces so far away would be a massive effort. The Nazis built death camps to imprison and kill Jews and other so-called undesirables. The largest and the most lethal of these camps was Auschwitz, Poland, where the Nazis used poison gas to murder more than 1 million people. This photograph of human bone pile was taken at Majdanek, another death camp in Poland. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, Wright, and Franklin Roosevelt left meet several times during the war to devise Allied strategy. In these meetings, they would debate various war plans. They would also come to develop strong relationships based on mutual respect. War in Europe, 1942 to 1945. By early 1942, Britain had clearly chosen its strategy. Because his country was caught in the battle against Rommel's forces, Churchill wanted the Allies to strike North Africa. In contrast, the Soviet leader, Joseph Stalin, supported an invasion of France to relieve his weakened army. Roosevelt's top military advisor, General George C. Marshall, also supported this option, but the plan had two glaring problems. First, the U.S. Army did not possess sufficiently trained combat forces, meaning the exhausted British Army would have to do most of the fighting. Second, German U-boats were sinking ships in the North Atlantic at an alarming rate, so transporting masses of soldiers and supplies to the staging area in Britain would be a dangerous and perhaps disastrous maneuver. In June, Roosevelt made his decision. U.S. forces would invade North Africa in the fall. Allies invade North Africa and Italy. In November 1942, Allied forces led by the American General Dwight D. Eisenhower made sea landings in Morocco and Algeria and then swept east into Tunisia. The Germans quickly sent reinforcements across the Mediterranean, while British forces defeated Rommel, forcing him from Egypt. Rommel's Africa Corps retreated west toward Tunisia, but with the British in pursuit. During a series of battles over the winter of 1942 to 43, American soldiers saw their first combat in the war. The U.S. Corps, which fought in many North African battles, benefited from the leadership of two brilliant generals, George Patton and Omar Bradley. These men helped the combined Allied armies launch a final offensive in May of 1943, after which Axis resistance in the region collapsed, leaving about 250,000 German and Italian soldiers at the mercy of the Allies. Using North Africa as a staging area, the Allies crossed the Mediterranean into Sicily, a large island in southern Italy. The massive Allied assault in July of 1943 met little opposition at first, and the success of the invasion scared Italy's political leaders. Mussolini's failed North Africa campaign and several other blunders caused the Italian people to lose faith in Il Duce. On July 24th, the Fascist Grand Council met and voted to restore the Italian king in Parliament. Mussolini resigned the next day, and Italy soon surrendered to the Allies. Its government signed an armistice in September, declaring war on Germany the next month. German forces were still present in Italy, however, so they continued to fight as Allied armies marched north. By October, the Allied army had taken about one-third of the Italian peninsula, but were unable to advance much farther that year. A solid German defensive line halted the Allies approximately 60 miles south of Rome, the Italian capital. Soviets fight alone at Stalingrad. The decision to invade North Africa had isolated the Soviets, so Hitler now had the opportunity to defeat the USSR with the summer offensive. Beginning in June of 1942, Axis troops pushed farther into Soviet territory. Hitler split his forces so they could seize the remainder of the Caucasus region and also take Stalingrad, a large city on the Volga River. German firebombs set most of Stalingrad aflame, but Stalin forbade his soldiers to retreat, ordering not a step back. By mid-September, Axis troops had trapped a large Soviet force in a strip of the city along the Volga. Fierce street-by-street fighting followed for 2 months. Then, in November, the Soviet Red Army began a counteroffensive and launched its defensive forces to challenge the Nazi assault. In a few days, the Soviets had successfully encircled the German troops. Hitler insisted that his soldiers fight to the death, and most complied. In January 1943, the remaining German forces, starving and frozen, surrendered to the Soviets. The Battle of Stalingrad cost Germany more than 200,000 troops, and over 1 million Soviet soldiers died. Nevertheless, the USSR forced the Germans to retreat and relinquish territory they had gained after June of 1942, including the Caucasus. Taking the war to the Germans by air. In losing the Caucasus, Hitler had only one major oil source left, Romania. Thus, the Romanian oil fields became a prime target for Allied strategic bombing. Strategic bombing involves hitting vital targets to destroy the enemy's war-making capacity. After American pilots flying B-24 Liberator and B-17 Flying Fortress bombers typically launched daytime raids and favored precision bombing of specific targets, flying at high altitude to avoid anti-aircraft fire, they dropped bombs on oil refineries, rail yards, factories, and U-boat bases. By the end of the war, Germany's infrastructure and economy were in ruins. British pilots relied mainly on saturation bombing, or the rapid release of a large number of bombs over a wide area. They usually flew nighttime raids over enemy cities. The goal of bombing cities, with its appalling loss of life, was to destroy civilian morale and force surrender. Although it turned German cities like Dresden and Hamburg into rebel-strewn graveyards, the strategy did not bring an early end to the war. In August of 1944, American planes dropped more than 1,000 bombs on an oil production facility in Poland, located 5 miles east of Auschwitz, the largest Nazi death camp. Jewish organizations, the War Refugee Board, and others urged the U.S. government to bomb Auschwitz, arguing that if the gas chambers or nearby rail lines were destroyed, thousands of lives could be saved. American military officials opposed bombing Auschwitz, claiming they could not afford to divert resources from military targets. They also argued that such bombings could kill many prisoners. Elie Wiesel, a prisoner at Auschwitz, said later that he would have welcomed the bombs anyway. "We were no longer afraid of death, at any rate not of that death," he recalled. "Every bomb filled us with joy and gave us new confidence in life." Yeah, that's fine, whatever. In August of 1944, American planes dropped more than 1,000 bombs on an oil production facility in Poland, located 5 miles east of Auschwitz, the largest Nazi death camp. American military officials proposed bombing Auschwitz, claiming it could not afford. Yeah, that one. Developing bombers like the B-24 Liberator and the B-17 Flying Fortress helped the Allies gain the advantage during the war. These planes were able to fly at higher altitudes and bomb German bases. In these bombers, American pilots generally conducted daytime raids and used precision bombing strategy to eliminate targets. Operation Overlord opens a new front in France. The Allies eventually chose not to bomb Auschwitz, claiming that doing so would delay the end of the war. To meet their objective, the Allied military instead focused most of its efforts in in 1944 on the invasion of France, codenaming the mission Operation Overlord. General Eisenhower directed the French invasion, commanding about 1,200 warships, 800 transport ships, 4,000 landing craft, 10,000 airplanes, and hundreds of tanks. Allied troops would cross the English Channel by ship and land on the beaches of Normandy in northern France. D-Day, the day the invasion began, occurred on June 6, 1944. Eisenhower sent the first wave of 156,000 troops with a message of hope. You will bring about the destruction of the German war machine, the elimination of Nazi tyranny over the oppressed peoples of Europe, and the security for ourselves in the free world. Eisenhower knew then that many of these men would not return. The landing craft unloaded Allied troops on Normandy's 5 beaches, while warships provided covering gunfire from offshore. German gun batteries aimed at the mass of invading soldiers who were wading ashore, crawling along the sand, and climbing the dunes and cliffs. One soldier later described his arrival at Omaha Beach, which saw the bloodiest fighting. "It seems like the whole world exploded. There was gunfire from the battleships, destroyers, and cruisers. The bombers were still hitting the beaches. As we went in, we could see small aircraft from the 116th Division that had gone in ahead sunk. There were bodies bobbing in the water, even out 3 or 4 miles. Lieutenant Robert L. Edlin from Gerald Astor, June 6, 1944, Voices of D-Day. The soldiers regrouped after their chaotic landing, and by the end of the first day, the Allies controlled the entire 59-mile section of the Normandy coast. In July, General Bradley and General Bernard Montgomery respectively led the American and British armies on a rapid sweep across France. The Allies liberated Paris that August, and in September, the first American GIs crossed the German border. President Ronald Reagan later described the D-Day invasion of France as the first step of the Allied attempt to seize back the continent of Europe. At least 2,500 American, British, and Canadian soldiers died in this massive effort. Their sacrifices helped turn the tide of the war and foil Nazi plans for world domination. Allies liberate Nazi concentration camps. While the Americans conducted the invasion of France, the Red Army chased a retreating German force out of the Soviet Union and into Poland. SS officials in Poland frantically attempted to hide concentration camp evidence from the approaching Red Army. They emptied many of the forced labor camps, marching prisoners westward and shooting those who fell behind. They also tried to dismantle some of the death camps quickly, killing the remaining prisoners. With the Red Army closing in on Auschwitz, the Nazis crowded about 60,000 Jews and others onto freight trains and shipped them west into Germany. The survivors were sent to camps like Buchenwald and Dachau. Allied soldiers fighting their way through the Germany stumbled upon concentration camps. Even these camps were not as grim as the death camps of Poland. They still shocked the soldiers. These camps held thousands of slave laborers starved nearly to death. Many of these were living skeletons. Too sick to eat, died within the first week of their liberation. At Dachau, the smell of rotting flesh directed GIs to 28 railway cars packed with dead bodies. They also uncovered evidence of medical research. SS camp doctors had carried out inhumane experiments on more than 3,500 prisoners. The Nazis had committed crimes so reprehensible that no word yet exists to describe their actions. In 1944, a Polish Jew coined the term genocide to refer to the systematic killing of a racial, political, or cultural group. The Nazis killed some 6 million Jews, about 40% of the world's Jewish population. An existing word meaning sacrifice by fire or Holocaust was capitalized and used to refer to this mass slaughter. The Holocaust was the Nazis' systemic, state-sponsored persecution and murder of Jews and other minority groups. The war in Europe ends with Germany's surrender. When the Allies crossed into Germany from France, they met fierce resistance, and by December 1944, their offensive had stalled. Hitler strategized to put through the Allied lines in the wooded Ardennes region of Belgium, where the American forces were weakest. He launched his counteroffensive on December 16th, when 8 German armored divisions smashed into the surprised Americans, creating a bulge in the American lines. Allied air support and fast action from Patton's Third Army forced German withdrawal by mid-January. The Battle of the Bulge was the last German offensive on the Western Front. By April 1945, the Red Army had fought its way through Poland into Germany and on the outskirts of Berlin. On April 30th, with advancing Soviet soldiers half a mile from his Berlin bunker, Hitler committed suicide. Germany's forces quickly began to surrender, and at midnight on May 8th, the war in Europe officially ended. President Roosevelt did not live to celebrate Victory in Europe Day or VE Day, since he had died on April 12th. The new president, Harry S. Truman, dedicated the victory to Franklin Roosevelt. Preparing for war in the Pacific. The course of World War II differed in Asia and in the Pacific. American forces in the Pacific needed several months to regroup after the surprising Pearl Harbor attack. During this time, Japan gained control over much of the region's natural resources, including oil and rubber. Japan formed what it called the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere through conquest, but co-prosperity did not refer to sharing wealth. Rather, Japan aimed to increase its own economic self-sufficiency and expand its political influence. The Japanese advance into Asia and the Pacific. Japan's attacks on Pearl Harbor was the first in the series of strikes against the Allied territory in the Pacific. By the end of March of 1942, Japanese had captured British Hong Kong and Singapore, the American islands of Guam and Wake, and the oil-rich Dutch East Indies. By this time, Japan had also invaded several larger possessions of the Allies, including the American-held Philippine Islands and the British colony of Burma. In the Philippines, Americans and Filipinos under General Douglas MacArthur resisted a fierce Japanese onslaught. Disease and malnutrition killed much of the defenders. Roosevelt ordered MacArthur to leave the islands in March, but upon his departure, the general promised, "I shall return." Japan succeeded in conquering the Philippines 2 months later. Shortly thereafter, the Japanese rounded up 70,000 starving, exhausted American and Filipino prisoners on the largest island and marched them up the Bataan Peninsula near Manila to a prison camp. During the brutal 63-mile march, Japanese soldiers beat and bayoneted many of the prisoners. More than 7,000 died on the infamous Bataan Death March. The fall of the British colony of Burma in May of 1942 had serious consequences for China. Japan already controlled most of coastal China, including the main ports, such that no supplies could reach the Chinese army by sea. Therefore, China relied on British and American supplies transported from India on the Burma Road, a lifeline that Japan now severed. The Allies were aware that if Japan defeated China, hundreds of thousands of Japanese soldiers would be free to fight elsewhere. Thus, the Allies came to China's aid by creating an airborne supply route over the Himalayas. The Pacific War begins in the air and at sea. Japan's string of victories in the Pacific hurt American morale, so Roosevelt urged his military chiefs to directly strike the Japanese home islands and restore confidence. They devised a plan to fly B-25 bombers off an aircraft carrier, since the planes could make short takeoffs and presumably had the range to reach Japan before landing at Allied airfields in China. On April 18, 1942, 16 bombers took off from the carrier Hornet, which had sailed to within 650 miles of Japan. Led by pilot Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle, the bombers targeted Tokyo and other Japanese cities. Although the bombs did little damage, the surprise attack shocked the Japanese and thrilled Americans. Japan reacted by dedicating more resources to defend their home islands and by devising a plan to destroy the remaining American fleet. This Japanese plan would prove disastrous. During Doolittle's raid, American codebreakers intercepted signals of enemy activity far to the south in the Coral Sea. Japan was moving to isolate Australia, a key American ally. To stop the Japanese, Admiral Chester Nimitz sent 2 aircraft carriers, several cruisers, and a few destroyers, everything he could spare. The American force would face a larger Japanese fleet, which included 3 carriers. The subsequent Battle of the Coral Sea, occurring in early May of 1942, was fought entirely by carrier-based aircraft. It marked the first naval battle in history in which the enemy's warships never sighted each other. Japanese aircraft sank the carrier Lexington and damaged Yorktown, while American planes sank one Japanese carrier and damaged the other 2. Despite fairly even losses, the Americans gained a strategic victory, blocked Japanese expansion to the south, and learned a valuable lesson. The Japanese Navy could be defeated. Military leaders consider their options in the Pacific. The Europe First strategy disadvantaged Pacific commanders who had fewer ships, planes, and soldiers than the Japanese. Therefore, the best strategy in the Pacific was a defensive one, in which American naval forces would attempt to contain the Japanese and halt Japanese expansion in the Central and South Pacific. Navy critics pointed out that the strategy enabled Japan to strengthen its control over newly won territories, making those territories harder to regain later. As part of their defensive strategy, these critics advised keeping the Japanese off balance by conducting occasional offensive maneuvers. The Navy officials who wanted to go entirely on the offensive debated different offensive strategies. One of their plans was to establish air bases in the Aleutian Islands, the region of Alaska that extends westward toward Japan. However, pilots and their crews would have to battle the snow, wind, and fog that afflicted this region, in addition to the enemy. Also, all supplies needed to be shipped from the U.S. mainland. Another idea was to construct bases in China, since China's coast would make an ideal staging area for an air assault on nearby Japan. The fuel bombs and parts... You ready? But the fuel and bombs and parts needed to keep the bombers in the air would best be delivered by sea, and the Japanese controlled China's ports. Inland air bases might have worked, but they would need to be supplied by planes flying over the Himalayas from India. A third offensive option called for liberating Japanese-held territory in the Pacific by freeing islands en route to Japan. American forces could gradually move to within B-29 striking distance. This process would take time, however, and Japanese resistance would strengthen as Americans moved closer to striking distance. In addition, many of the islands were well fortified, so American casualties would be significant. War in the Pacific, 1942 to 1945. The Americans led the Allied forces in the Pacific and did the bulk of the fighting there. When they went on the offensive, the Allies decided to liberate Japanese-held islands in the Pacific and then use them as stepping stones toward Japan. In this way, each captured island served as a base for assault on other islands as Allies approached Japan. One of the keys to Allied success in the Pacific was the use of secret codes. The United States trained a group of Navajo Indian code talkers for this task. Because Navajo is not a written language and is understood only by very few people, it made an excellent code for code foundation. The Navajo talkers played an important role in the Pacific campaign since they enabled the Allies to transmit vital information. The Japanese offensive ends at the Battle of Midway. Before the Allies could go on the offensive, they first had to stop the Japanese expansion, which they achieved at the Battle of Midway. In June of 1942, the Americans intercepted the Japanese message detailing plans for a major offensive and discovered that Japan's target was the U.S. base at Midway, a pair of islands about 1,200 miles northwest of Pearl Harbor. With this knowledge, the Navy lay in wait for the Japanese fleet. Although Japanese naval strategists hoped to destroy U.S. Pacific Fleet at Midway, their plan, since Doolittle's raid on Tokyo, the U.S. Navy won a resounding victory there. American planes flying from Midway and 3 additional aircraft carriers demolished the enemy force, destroying all 4 Japanese carriers, a cruiser, and approximately 300 aircraft. Japan never recovered from the heavy losses of its carriers and experienced pilots. The Battle of Midway was Japan's last offensive action. From that point on, Japan would focus on defense. Liberating the Pacific Islands proves costly. A strategy known as leapfrogging enabled the Americans to shift to the offensive with limited resources. In this method, the American forces would often leapfrog or bypass heavily defended islands to capture a nearby island that was not well defended. Then the captured islands was used as an airbase to bomb the well-defended Japanese-held island and prevent ships from resupplying it. Cut off from reinforcement and supplies, the Japanese forces would be left to wither. General MacArthur described this leapfrogging approach as "hit 'em where they ain't, let 'em die on the vine." Despite the success of leapfrogging, many of these island invasions came at a terrible cost. Thousands of Allied soldiers died in the jungles of Guadalcanal, New Guinea, Tarawa, and Saipan, but they kept forcing the Japanese back closer and closer to the home islands. In October of 1944, MacArthur made his triumphant return to the Philippines, where his forces would fight the Japanese for the remainder of the war. In August of 1944, the Marines successfully retook the Mariana Islands in a landmark victory that provided secure bases from which long-range B-29s could execute strategic bombing raids on Japan. The final push towards Japan brings heavy losses. The Allied push through the Pacific steadily shrank Japan's defensive perimeter around its home islands, a security net that would all but disappear if the Allies could capture the key islands of Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Iwo Jima's airfields would offer a place for B-29s to land in an emergency, and they would also serve as a base for fighter planes escorting bombers over Japan. Control of Okinawa, just 310 miles south of Japan, would provide a prime staging area for the U.S. invasion of Japan. To face these encroaching threats, Japanese military leaders moved their best forces from Japan to China to defend the 2 islands, from Japan and China to defend the 2 islands. On the small volcanic island of Iwo Jima, the Japanese forces dug caves, tunnels, and concrete-lined bunkers. 3 months of Allied bombardment before February of 1945 invasion did little to weaken this defense. This followed a month-long Battle of Iwo Jima. The following month-long Battle of Iwo Jima. Go ahead. The following month-long battle of Iwo Jima was among the bloodiest of the war. Nearly 22,000 Japanese troops followed their commander's orders to fight to the death, and more than 6,800 American troops died to secure the island. Admiral Nimitz noted that on Iwo Jima, uncommon valor was a common virtue. To take the much larger island of Okinawa, Allies mounted a huge amphibious or sea-to-land invasion. On April 1945, over 1,200 Americans and British ships, including 40 aircraft carriers, supported a combined Army Marine force of 182,000. As on Iwo Jima, the 120,000 troops defending Okinawa strongly resisted the American invaders. The bloody combat of the Battle of Okinawa, much of it hand-to-hand, continued for 2 months. The battle claimed the lives of some 12,000 American soldiers and more than 100,000 Japanese. Meanwhile, another form of combat was occurring in the surrounding waters. Earlier in the Pacific War, the Japanese introduced a new weapon called the kamikaze pilots. In kamikaze attacks, hundreds of men flew their bomb-filled planes directly into Allied fleet vessels, sinking and damaging hundreds of ships. During these battles, kamikazes failed to sink aircraft carriers, which were their main targets. The Manhattan Project develops a top-secret weapon. The stage was now set for an invasion of Japan, but the United States had scientists developing another option. In 1939, German-American scientist Albert Einstein wrote to President Roosevelt explaining that scientists may soon be able to transform uranium into a new form of energy. This energy, he claimed, could be harnessed to build extremely powerful bombs. Einstein expressed his fear that Germany was already engaged in experiments to create an atomic bomb. The power of the explosive weapon is derived from the energy suddenly released by splitting the nuclei of uranium or plutonium atoms. 3 years after Einstein sent his letter, the government established the Manhattan Project, a top-secret program to develop an atomic weapon. A team of scientists, many of whom had fled fascist European nations, conducted the project's research and development. Their work was completed mostly at a lab in Los Alamos, New Mexico, and by the summer of 1945, their efforts had produced the first atomic bomb. On July 16th, that test bomb was exploded on a remote airbase in the New Mexico desert. Physicist J. Robert Oppenheimer witnessed the blinding flash of light, intense heat, and a violent shockwave from the bomb's explosion, later stating that the blast reminded him of a line from Hindu scripture, I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. Truman faces a decision to drop the bomb. After the successful test of the atomic bomb, or A-bomb, President Truman had to decide whether to drop the bomb on Japan. After the successful test of the atomic bomb, or A-bomb, President Truman had to decide whether to drop the bomb on Japan or to launch a land invasion. After the battles of Iwo Jima and Okinawa, Truman knew Americans would sustain enormous casualties throughout an invasion. He was told that the number of Allies killed and wounded might reach 500,000. Furthermore, Truman faced a stubborn enemy. American B-29s were already destroying Japan with conventional bombs, including incendiaries. These firebombs killed hundreds of thousands of people and razed large areas of major Japanese cities with their numerous wooden buildings into cinders. Meanwhile, an American naval blockade severed the supply of raw materials to Japan, and the combination of bombing and blockade left many Japanese starving. Even though many of Japan's leaders realized that their country could not possibly win the war, they refused to accept Truman's terms of unconditional surrender. Hey! Bad. You bad. You bad. 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 United States bombs Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Truman did not compromise on his demand for ending. No, some officials, no. Oppenheimer and others believed only the shock of an atomic bomb would end Japanese resistance. Some officials objected to dropping the atomic bomb. General Curtis LeMay insisted that his B-29 bombing campaign would soon induce Japan's surrender. General Eisenhower agreed with General LeMay, later writing, "It was my belief that Japan was at the very moment seeking some way to surrender with a minimum loss of face, honor. Others maintained that Japan would surrender if Truman allowed the nation to retain its emperor. The United States bombs Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Truman did not compromise on his demand for unconditional surrender, informing Japan that its alternative was prompt and utter destruction. On August 6, 1945, a B-29 named the Enola Gay dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima, Japan, a city of 300,000 people. Up to 80,000 people died within seconds of the explosion. The blast shock wave toppled nearly 60,000 structures, and hundreds of fires consumed the remainder of the city. 3 days later, the United States dropped a second atomic bomb that obliterated the city of Nagasaki, killing some 40,000 people instantly. As many as 250,000 Japanese may have died from the two atomic bombs, either directly or as a result of the burns, radiation poisoning, or cancer. Truman had no regrets, later stating, "Let there be no mistake about it. I regarded the bomb as a military weapon and never had any doubt that it should be used." The destruction of Nagasaki forced a Japanese surrender. Truman received Japan's informal surrender on August 14th, known as Victory over Japan, VJ Day. The terms of surrender allowed the emperor to retain his office, but only in a ceremonial role. The Allies officially accepted the surrender aboard the American battleship Missouri in Tokyo Bay. Millions celebrated VJ Day, which marked the end of the Second World War, but also mourned their severe losses. About 55 million died over the course of the war, 30 million of them civilians. The Soviet Union suffered the highest human loss. Over 20 million of its people were killed. Some 400,000 Americans, nearly all in the military, gave their lives during the war. Most Americans believed strongly that these soldiers, sailors, and airmen and others died for a noble cause.